So I suppose you come more down on the interpretation that there is no kind of spiritual aspect to this, or transcendent kind of supernatural aspect.
No,
to
not at all. It's interesting
don't.
that you might conjecture that, but well, to be honest, I try to bridge it literally as much as I possibly can. The spiritual possibility of a spiritual dimension and the, material, biological. Yeah, to be honest, on a personal level, it fluctuates. It just fluctuates. Like when I first started, I think I probably held out more optimism or hope, or however you want to couch it, as to transcendent reality, especially as indicated by near-death experiences. And then going through the process of the PhD, obviously immersing myself in all the literature, because I wanted to have, because my undergraduate was actually neuroscience, and then I did a master's in mental health sciences, and so very traditional mainstream education. So I wanted to bring that to my near-death research, and so I'm looking at all the near-death, the Journal of Near-Death Studies, the other parapsychological journals, but then also looking at a lot of the stuff that those kind of journals and researchers really don't generally cite. So looking at different university institutions and their laboratories, which have very direct implications for the matter, like in this case NDEs. So going through all of that, it made me think, there's actually, it kind of ushered me, let's say, a bit more toward the reductionist interpretation. But equally, despite that, I'm also reading all the other things which aren't so neatly explained by the reductionist model, and so my mind is always open. It's always fluctuating. So there's very much an agnostic element to it. But yeah. So I guess maybe why you asked is, I couched it as a psychopharmacological model, DMT for NDEs. So maybe when you die, people just have these experiences because it's just DMT being released. It's just this chemical. It's just a hallucination. But obviously that paints that picture, but I don't necessarily think that's the whole story at all. Like I think reality, consciousness especially, is so much wilder than we would anticipate. So yeah, the jury is very much still out.
So coming from kind of, you say, the very mainstream education, your background in neurochemistry or neurophysics or whatever it was it neuroscience just in general?
Neuroscience, yeah.
What do you think about those who say that the consensus of every neuroscientist and every person in that mainstream kind of scientific background is that consciousness is definitely, no question, produced by the brain?
What would I say about that? I'd say, first of all, that it's different across the spectrum of scientists and scientific disciplines. Like those people who are engaged in cosmology, quantum physics, are much more likely to be sympathetic to or really believe in transcendent reality of some description. And it's interesting because they have a much better grip on the fundamentals of reality, and they're more likely to go in that direction. And then you kind of scale it down to biology and chemistry and things, and then those scientists are more a kind of that classic image of a scientist that is a staunch materialist. So I would say, I don't know, there's probably great surveys out there, but I don't know. So, but I would imagine that those would be much more likely to have that opinion that the consciousness is just a product of the brain. But then, especially the irony, I think, is that you'd imagine that neuroscientists should have the best answers to these questions, and so you'd ask them, right, first and foremost. But there's always just the hard problem of consciousness. These neuroscientists have the most detailed maps of the brain, and the substrates, the correlates of consciousness of the brain in their own brain, and so that would naturally lead them to be much more confident in their kind of conclusions that the brain must just be the producer of it, because what the hell else could it be? And when you start asking that question, it just becomes a spiritual question. So
it does. And certainly, as you say, the physicists and the quantum physicists are dealing with the very fundamentals of reality, whereas the neuroscientists are focusing on kind of an aspect that emerges from that foundation of physics and quantum physics. So I think it's kind of like looking at a picture and dissecting the meaning behind a picture, whereas the quantum physicists and physicists would be looking at the artist and his background and things like that. I suppose that sort of thing, just off the top of my head as an analogy.
Yeah. Well, I really like that analogy. Yeah. I really like that analogy. Yeah.
Thanks. Brilliant. Okay, so when did you first get interested in near-death experiences, and what was kind of your first initial assumption about them? Because when I first looked at them, my initial thought was hallucination, dying brain, lack of oxygen, all that kind of stuff, until I started looking at things like the University of Virginia, Bruce Grayson, Jan Holden, and looking at some of the literature of veridical perception. I mean, that's the main thing that switched me between near-death experiences and near-death experiences with veridical perception, that started bringing in the evidential value. So how did you approach it?
Yeah, I mean, it's not too far off, and I think that's a common pattern, with people that really, once they really immerse themselves in this field, that kind of trajectory is common, I think. But for me, it was a very gradual process of, how I actually ended up doing a PhD in the matter. But when I was a teenager, I was always my general disposition has always been one which intuitively felt a different layer to the world, let's say. I guess there was this implicit kind of mystical type sensibility, like there's something else going on, something's happening, this is not just prima facie just objective reality, so, and lots of that has led to, in later life, to actual experiences, sort of out-of-body type experiences, lucid dreams, very many precognitive or like candidate, precognitive dreams, which I track sort of almost every day in psychedelic experiences, and the different, obviously, transcendent or otherwise anomalous experiences associated with that, but not massively. I actually deliberately tried to, might not look like it with my long hair and like my flower of life, hoodie and everything, but I do deliberately try to measure it out, so I'm not a psychonaut, a real psychonaut. So but yeah, I mean, my mum probably at an early age was very influential, just giving me lots and lots of books. So in terms of near-death experiences, definitely those were the ones which spoke to me very immediately at an earlier age, and I just kind of plowed my way through a lot of the classic near-death books from some years back. So yeah, I mean, so near-death experiences is just something, because I had this, like I'm saying, like I always had this parallel scientific sensibility. I felt that near-death experiences were very empirical, they're a very empirical window into, well, everything, and especially death, but then via death, how that,
what else
encapsulates
it expands into the fundamental nature of nature, doesn't it, really?
Yeah, it's like, well, that's like one of the biggest questions, isn't it? Like that's often sometimes said, like, is there a God, or what happens when we die, and like, are we alone in the universe, are there like extraterrestrials and stuff? So,
I mean, if you look at the question, what happens when we die, that then opens so many questions. If you get evidence to suggest we may survive death, well, what does that mean about what we are then, and what does that mean about where we came from and where we started, and what does that mean about the universe? And it branches off into so many more questions, which is the whole point of science.
Exactly.
I suppose I immediately thought that you were going to be more on the kind of materialistic stance, because as you say, when you brought up about the chemical correlations of DMT and consciousness, and also that I read your article that you posted in the forum chat, and that seemed to come across as you were more skeptical on the side of near-death experiences, which is...
Did it? The one about the Medium article about the surviving death?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Did it come across that way?
It did slightly to me, but that's certainly not skeptical as in what you'd normally think of as skeptical, but open, very open, but more on the this isn't definitive kind of thing, which I agree with.
You agree with?
I agree that the surviving death was lacking with the evidential value, especially the mediumship episodes. They were just ridiculous in my opinion. But with the near-death experiences, you know, they could have had more of a skeptical view on things as well. And you know, some of the people that they could have had, Pim van Lommel, Penny Sartori, people who'd really done the literature. I mean, Bruce Grayson was ideal, but there wasn't enough time to really dig into the scientific literature. It was more, it seemed, for entertainment value for me.
Yeah, I certainly say, I think we're on the same page there. They did have Grayson. They did have the kind of UK equivalent of the near-death experience, Doyen, Peter Fenwick, exactly. And but like you say, it was on Netflix. It was for mass production and consumption, so it's obviously going to be more erring to that side. But you know, even that side, like as I mentioned in the article, and maybe this is why, you know, you considered it perhaps more toward the skeptical. You know, it while they did have granted two well-known psychiatrists, you know, specialists in near death, they, like I kind of was alluding to before, there wasn't, and there generally isn't in a lot of these discussions of near-death experience, even in the journals and stuff, there isn't the time of day given to some really fascinating research with direct implications for the near-death experience, which may look like there's a skeptical agenda or conclusion, but you can't, that's no excuse to just avoid looking at it. So particularly, you know, there's some really great work going on in University of Michigan, and it's kind of, you know, it's really looking at the neurobiology of death, of consciousness at the point of death. I mean, in that case, they're a laboratory, so they're looking at rodent models, and they're inducing experimental cardiac arrest, and they're measuring both cortical brainwaves and the actual release of endogenous neurotransmitters and neuromodulators. And so, you know, it's been around for over 5 years. The finding that when they do this to rats, there's just there's barely not one neurotransmitter, you know, at that point of cardiac arrest, which isn't massively released. It's quite extraordinary, some of the particular neurotransmitters, how increased they really are, what orders of magnitude they're increased. And you know, those are different ones. The main ones, like the monoamines, like people are familiar with, like dopamine, noradrenaline. Serotonin was especially high, and that is of course the chemical which psychedelics act on. So that's very interesting for me, because while I'm looking at DMT, I think that evidence, you know, and there's other kind of parallel evidence, you know, it suggests that serotonin itself, not necessarily needing to invoke other chemicals like DMT, which are considered like endogenous psychedelics, like serotonin could be responsible in a large way for the near-death experience, if of course all of this translates and scales up to human beings, and if of course, big caveat, serotonin is in fact psychedelic. Psychedelics act on the serotonin system. We don't fully know if serotonin is psychedelic, but I just imagine, well, it's not just imagining, like there is some evidence that serotonin, high levels of serotonin induce what's the mouse head twitch, or the psychedelic signature move, as a researcher at Imperial called it. So that's the behavioral index of having a psychedelic experience for these animal models. So it's like serotonin, that's one that you need in science, you need layers and layers of nested evidence in order for people to accept it. So that's not enough, but I think it suggests that serotonin could be very well implicated.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And then I suppose at the end of the day, you know, you always come back to, you've got the correlates of psychedelic experience and serotonin, but then you always end up coming back to that hard problem of consciousness, or how does that manifest itself through neurochemicals. I mean, psychedelics, we don't know how they work. I mean, we assume that they generate some kind of illusory experience in consciousness, but others will say, well, we've seen from studies of psilocybin and things that they actually reduce the level of brain activity, which could suggest that they are kind of giving us access to more natural consciousness. They're preventing the brain from filtering to a certain level. And was it psilocybin reduces the
default mode network?
Default mode network, yeah, that's right. And which gives you the sense of being kind of an individual, I suppose. And when that's shut down through psilocybin, it gives you this feeling of oneness and whatever, and how that happens, whether that's just an issue from the hallucination caused by the lack of activity there, or whether that lack of activity is giving way to more natural experience.
Yeah. Do you want me to speak to that?
Yeah, sure.
It's an interesting thing, and I again always want to caveat with, like, people always need to be like humble in terms of the wealth of evidence and lack of knowledge, but this is often quoted, with psychedelics, because when those neuroimaging studies came out, because they just came out in like pretty much the last decade, no one had ever done neuroimaging studies with psychedelics before, like maybe some EEG stuff, very basic stuff in the first wave and stuff. So it's incredible how the implications, and it's so exciting, and they will continue to unlock, the mystery of the mechanisms of consciousness related to the brain. Again, as you say, there's always this philosophical conundrum of the hard problem and stuff, but with the psychedelics decreasing global activity of the brain, and then that being often quoted as being evidence for the kind of transmission theory of the brain and consciousness, and that clearly this is evidence for the brain just being a filter of consciousness. Psychedelics decrease brain activity, yet it induces this experience of heightened consciousness, and this entheogenic experiences, right, mystical experiences of ego dissolution, like you say, connection to the universe. So, but then that, and I get that's really compelling, but there's and it's not even that much more nuanced. Like, just what people always need to remember is it's not as simple as the brain activity being decreased. Like you said, it's the default mode network which is reduced in activity. It's actually, like, more technical way of saying it's disintegrated, not like it's not like it's obliviated or obliterated, but it's disintegrated in its internal consistency in terms of its how its activity relates to its own activity within the network.
I've read it becomes less organized as such.
Yeah. And so within that network, when that happens, that then causes what's referred to as desegregation of all the other disparate networks in the brain. So that means that the brain is just hyper connected, right? It's all different modules of the brain which usually don't talk to each other, and has evolved very especially so that is the case, so as we function as in the way that we do, basically, so as we're not always tripping, so they're always segregated. And then suddenly, under the psychedelic experience, when the DMN is reduced in activity, it becomes disintegrated, then because it's a hub, which, it's this very particular hub which serves this function, that means that the brain is globally connected. And that could well be this neural, let's say, correlate instead of like substrate of this heightened awareness of these mystical experiences,
Right, I see. So when the default mode network is disintegrated, as you say, effectively the brain is in complete connection with itself, whereas it'd normally be limited to one area or whatever.
Yeah,
which
pretty much,
right,
so.
Which could be used as an argument to suggest that these experiences are purely neurochemical.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm saying. I mean, but again, I mean, this has like just massive implications, because it's like, well, because we're not really talking about just people being given psilocybin pills in an fMRI scanner, and then it increases experiences of the mystical, and also increases this particular type of brain pattern. This has real implications for like the genesis of like religion in human history. And it's like, okay, these drugs, these substances are producing experiences of the mystical. And not only that, it's not only this overwhelming feeling of like the mystical, and it what all that entails is like the noetic experience, which is like touching the ground of reality, and it's like a conviction in that. And then there's also very many studies now coming out about belief change, and how people who were previously atheists, when they report their first encounter with an entity on DMT, it's like something like 2/3 of them, I think, if I'm getting that statistic correctly, who used to be atheists are no longer atheists. So they believe, so they didn't believe and they suddenly believe. So it creates this sense of this construct within them of the afterlife. And so this probably happened thousands of years ago, when people were having these experiences. However, which way that was being produced, so many different theories, but a lot of which centering around these entheogenic substances with the advent of shamanism, and then that creating afterlife beliefs, the genesis of like religion. So it's like, so these experiences, but that like we're saying is like, well, if this new brain activity that we're identifying under psychedelics is can still just can still explain the mystical experience, then you're kind of not just underwriting those people when the brain scan as religious experiences, you're underwriting possibly just all of religion. So it's a big question.
It is a very big question. So what was your you said you've had experiences with out of body experiences and psychedelic experiences. Can you describe some of those and what kind of that brought you to in terms of your worldview, I suppose, if you want to use that term?
It's a difficult one to track. I mean, one person's worldview should be quite important to know where it came from. But I really wouldn't necessarily ascribe my like psychedelic experiences as really being significantly formative in my worldviews, perhaps because like we were saying, like people who were very reductionist and atheistic and stuff, they then have such an experience which is so ontologically shocking that then it might flip them. But for me, like, I was never a staunch atheist. I was always had a good level of skepticism, so perhaps because of that, those experiences didn't necessarily like throw me out into the stratosphere, into like undeniable like belief.
Because you didn't have anything that was to be shaken up. You were always, because you didn't have any belief that was to be shaken up. Yeah, kind of thing. Yeah. So but I think to be honest, it's my potential precognitive dreams. I think, because obviously I've read a lot and I researched a lot about parapsychology, and like you say, like it was the veridical kind of near-death experiences which really like particularly was salient for you. And it's similar for me. It's like you can think about all these brain mechanisms and the hard problem and etc. But then it's like, well, there's pretty bloody good evidence, regardless of what the skeptics say, because skeptics typically don't immerse themselves in the literature, bloody good evidence for psi, and very much so at the point of death as well. And I think there's a lot of reason that it's at the point of death as well. So it's both a combination of the understanding of the literature and my own personal experience of those kind of just anomalous things which just happen just way too often for me to easily write them off, and they're far too specific for me to write them off. And I chronicle them and I try, and I'm skeptical. Like I've in my list of my compiling of dreams that I have, it's like I kind of categorize them as I think about what happened in the day prior and the day after, what potential things could have primed my dream content, and seeing what imagery in my dream that is related to what happens the following day could be
chalked up to something that primed me beforehand, so it's just normal linear time as opposed to a precognitive effect. And thinking about how unlikely that
level of
correlation
coincidence would
is
be.
compared to other ones. And so some are like possible precognitive, and some are like
that's beyond the realms of yeah. I see what you mean. So I mean, out of body experiences and lucid dreaming is something that I've been working towards achieving, because I used to try it with the Monroe CDs. Don't know if you know Monroe Institute CDs. Yeah, I'm sure you would. And I ended up losing. I didn't have any time to do it, so I've started doing that again. I've started, as you say, dream journaling. Don't think you've seen it. But a lot of it you read over and you end up laughing, thinking, "What the hell was that all about?" I mean, I dreamt about Harry Potter recently, and I don't know why. I haven't watched it or listened to it in years.
Yeah.
But things like that, and I started working through a course from the International Academy of I think it's the International Academy of Consciousness. I can never remember the name. It's IAC, who do it's called the Consciousness Development Program, where you work with energies, moving energies up and down in your body, and doing all this sort of thing to enhance the possibility of having an out-of-body experience. So I started working towards that, and I haven't really felt anything yet, but I'm going to continue to do it, because I think if I can have an out-of-body experience and see something that I can verify later, that would be huge for my...
Yeah.
And there are accounts of that taking place, but unfortunately, because you're relying on someone else's testimony and it's not a personal experience, it's difficult to accept.
Yeah, it is, and it's really amazing. This is similar. I think it's really all pervasive. What Gregory Shushan was talking about on your show, and his main thesis of the experiential source hypothesis. And it's like, even if you've got all this evidence, and even if other people have these unbelievable, impossible experiences, if you don't have the experience yourself, you won't believe. So just like, if you don't have the experience of the transcendent, you won't believe in the transcendent reality. It's like, it's like this. It's like a weird spiritual positivism, actually, because it's like it's this empirical, like, evidence-based faith. It's like, but it's personal evidence-based faith. It's like, so yeah. I mean, the thing, I haven't tried to induce really that systematically these out-body experiences, like in the kind of way that you're kind of describing for yourself. Like, a lot of them have just been, I was reflecting on this recently, like most of my anomalous experiences are dream and sleep related, and that makes plenty of sense. I mean, they're like substance related often as well, but because of what we're saying about, I mean, that's a good example. I mean, like, even though these mystical experiences, like under psychedelics, for instance, and I was just reading a paper just this morning about how the dream phenomenology and brain state is very, very similar to psychedelic brain and state and phenomenology. So it is, so despite the mystical experience maybe being correlated with this hallucinogenic activity in the brain, there's and again, dream state can be just related to the brain activity, but the anomalous phenomena, that again is less easily attributable to the brain, because it's a material, or at least what we consider the brain being in our limited understanding, because it is the most complex object in the known universe. It seems to be this materialist thing, it's this object, but it's probably much more than that. So how does that relate to the parapsychological phenomena, which there seems to be good, like, evidence for? It's not just anecdotal, but it's actually experimental. So anyway, I'm kind of going off on one, but I thought that was an important tangent to make. So a lot of my, I haven't had a fully blown, like, out-body experience, but in good few of my dream experiences, there's been partial, like, out-body experiences, loads of lucid dreams, which obviously is phenomenologically similar, it's kind of astral projection like. But I haven't had veridical perception, which is annoying, because that would be great. Because I was very clear, because in these states you're often very, very lucid, and I'm like, okay, fine, I'm looking around my room, right? That's there, this is there. And then coming back, and then realizing that, you know,
It's
it's just
nothing like it.
no, it's just a disconnection between what your OB vision of your room was and then what actually looks like, which is silly on multiple levels, because you're probably most familiar with your room in like out of all spaces, and yet you still get it wrong.
And most people will say, well, that's especially the astral projectors themselves will say, well, you know, the astral realm of your room is going to be slightly different because it's less material or whatever. And to me, I'm thinking that's not enough for me, because, you know, if I'm in a normal dream, I can dream about my house and it won't be the same. You know, I can easily attribute that to just hypnagogic hallucination or whatever. And it's the same with near-death experiences, and generally out-of-body experiences. You know, if someone says, and I was talking to Dr. Gary Habermas, and he was quite right when he was saying, you know, a lot of these near-death experiences where people go and see the being of light, go to this field or this heaven-like realm, and then come back and tell about it, is all very good and it's very life-changing. But for me, it's not enough, because, you know, there's no verifiable thing that can say that that's what definitely happened. It's the same when people go out of body and see deceased people, or walk around in these realms and talk to people they perceive to be individuals. Unless there's something that they've seen in the real world that can be verified by third parties and was not known, you know, to me everything else can be easily attributed to hallucination or brain-related chemical issues. So, until you have that verification, the level of evidence isn't enough for me.
Yeah,
it probably would be if I was to experience it myself, but that's a different
kind of, yeah, exactly.
You can never convince anybody else other than with some sort of veridical perception.
Exactly. That's like with near-death experiences. It's like, yeah, it's proof of the afterlife for them, but not for anyone else. Yeah, no, I completely agree, and I really do. You know, listen to some of your podcasts, and I do think you've got a very, very level-headed sort of attitude about this. It's very true. I mean, it's you. Yeah, I mean, I think there is some elements. I mean, first of all, that I do agree with you with what you say on one level. Like, certainly the veridical aspects and the parapsychological aspects, it holds much more weight from a kind of scientific perspective. But like, for instance, with DMT, which is what I'm studying, and it's, you know, funny I haven't spoken about it a great deal, maybe because I'm so sick of it. But it's so the theory being that DMT, yes, it's an endogenous chemical and it is psychedelic. I mean, that's weird in and of itself.
Endogenous meaning endogenous meaning it's produced in the human body.
Exactly. Yeah. But there's lots of evidence, especially from Edi Frexka in Hungary, that it's neuroprotective and anti-inflammatory, and even other studies I think now showing that it's neurogenic. So it can produce new, like, neurons and neuronal connections. So and it preserves the cellular viability, you know, under states of like anoxia, you know, lack of brain oxygen, like at the time of death. So they've done this in vitro and in vivo. So that makes sense and there's a whole other parallel theory about endogenous ketamine-like chemicals that can also be reproduced at the time of death for exactly the same reasons. But both of them, so yeah, they're neuroprotective, got them in our body. Well, actually, that's why DMT is probably cooler to look at, because we know it's in our body, whereas these other ketamine-like chemicals, there are loads of possible candidates, but no one really knows. So they're neuroprotective, they're in our bodies, and therefore they are psychedelic, and therefore they probably may well be released at the time of death to account for these experiences, and therefore, from an evolutionary perspective, they're only there and only released at such given times so as to increase the likelihood of the survival of the organism, right?
Has it, just before you go on, sorry, has it been shown that the DMT is produced for definite in the human brain? Is it produced in enough volume to produce a psychedelic experience?
Well, that's a very good question. Probably should have addressed that earlier. I should have. Again, people get confused about this. It's only been, I mean, it's incredible landmark, groundbreaking study, but 2019, only then was it found, and again in rodents, that with induction of experimental death, DMT was produced, and it was significantly higher than baseline levels. And the necessary enzymatic machinery to produce DMT was present in the rat cortex, and quite astonishingly, DMT was at the same levels as normal traditional transmitters like serotonin, which is pretty much not expected. Like, it was considered this trace amine maybe increased in high levels at these specific conditions, but actually it was at like regular levels and then spiked, I think about 6 times fold was, I think, the max that it increased to. But like you say, that's all very well and good, but even that level may well not be sufficient to activate the serotonin 2A receptor, which is the receptor upon which psychedelics act and through which presumably these experiences, like near-death experiences, occur. So I've had, Dean at this university I mentioned, Michigan, the same university who found all these other neurotransmitters spiking at the time of death. He's communicated to me, that this is just early days. It's like, you can't just always throw the baby out the bathwater, dependent on, cherry picking of the evidence and etc. It's like, they only found it at intervals, spaced intervals in specific areas of the brain, literally, I think in the DMT case, just the occipital cortex. So it could be with later, and they will do this, like with more fine-grained experimentation, they'll do it at like minute or more like intervals, like they did in the previous study with all the other neurotransmitters, and they'll do it globally in the brain, or hopefully, I hope they will, and that then could mean that, well, actually there is sufficient DMT in order to produce these experiences. But then these two papers are very good in parallel, because, and again, Nichols is famous psychedelic chemist, then rebutted like with these papers and saying that the serotonin like deluge in the brain would just drown out DMT, like both because it's such higher levels, but also importantly, and I guess this is more technical pharmacology, that serotonin has a much greater affinity for this particular 2A receptor than DMT. So
it's much more likely to bind.
Pardon?
So it's, in simple terms, it's much more likely to bind with that receptor than DMT.
Yeah, absolutely, exactly. So it's high levels and more likely to bind anyway. So it's like, again, less. I think there's this, I don't know what exactly it's driven by, perhaps because no one really thinks serotonin or even these other neurotransmitters could have psychedelic-like effects. And so there's like this, you can imagine it from a general popular perspective that people are kind of obsessed with DMT. So they want DMT to be the thing. But even from the scientific perspective, it's like there is some, at least especially in Michigan, this university, they're really thinking that DMT not just might well be involved in the near-death experience. I mean, I think Jimo Borgigan, the head of the lab, has very much this reductionist perspective that, yeah, it's just hallucination from DMT. But yeah, it's I kind of lost my track of thought there, but it's like it
happens to me often.
Yeah, it's just that it doesn't necessarily need to be DMT. I mean, they in fact think that DMT, because it's like these canonical levels, is like probably included in psychosis, probably got a role to play in dreams and all that. So you can over-ascribe lots of things to this one chemical, and I guess that's quite kind of like the dangers of scientific process in the community, in the industry, because it's like, oh yeah, I got this theory, yeah, there's loads of this mounting evidence, and you can kind of just cloister your way and narrow yourself into that direction and believe it the whole way. They could be completely right, like there is good evidence and it could just continue to gain traction. But
so I suppose because there are similarities in the near-death experience, and DMT shows that DMT may very well be involved but may not be exclusively responsible for the experience.
Yeah, exactly. And that's basically what I'm doing my whole PhD. You summed it up really nicely right there, like that I quote you at the end there. Yeah, exactly. I mean, but then again, like the DMT experience is and it isn't similar to the near-death experience. So again, that can be really overestimated in the kind of public eye, especially, and even, you know, in scientific circles. Like, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm really elucidating the nuanced differences. And basically, I think that the not to like just announce the kind of my conclusions without, but I haven't properly fully published them yet, but they're superficial similarities. There's like a gross structure to both experiences, DMT and near-death experience, and DMT replicates them really bloody well. You know, this idea of disembodiment, dissociation from the body, you know, movement towards, you know, or into a different, novel, immersive space, and then there's these apparently non-self agents that you're interacting with. That happens with both near-death experience and DMT. But, you know, that's only, you know, and of course there's the mystical experience, which has multiple dimensions. And then there's lots of psychological and emotional elements. And so, you know, like increased sort of lucidity, and maybe some anomalous phenomena, and like, you know, deep, intense, you know, profound bliss, or even like severe anxiety. Like, so all of that is pretty much the skeleton shared by both experiences, but it's just really a skeleton.
Yeah. So within that, there are nuanced differences.
Yeah. So when you look at the nuanced phenomenology, which is what the vast majority of my PhD is, they're completely idiosyncratic. Like, you know, in very short terms, without going on too much about it, but, you know, the near-death experience is kind of characterized by, for the very most part, like meeting deceased loved ones, beings of light, which are very much beings of light. They're often like sort of paternal or amorphous, and they're composed of light, and they, yeah, and the out-of-body experience, kind of at the beginning of it, is very much classic out-of-body experience. Whereas with DMT, it's just dissociation and lack of awareness of the body, and then ending up elsewhere. So, yeah, the environment, you know, like you mentioned with near-death experiences, quite incredible how, and even Gregory Shushan, you know, a lot of the indigenous and early civilization near-death experiences or afterlife narratives are very much like fields and, you know, valleys and natural, beautiful environments, and that obviously is probably very deeply evolutionarily ingrained of like bounty and like, and, you know, just, and our environment as an organism, that's what our natural imperative is to be like habituated to a plentiful environment. So that's very deep in there. So that's kind of common with near-death experience, especially, and modern ones. Near-death DMT, it's just, you know, there's basically nothing under the sun that you probably couldn't get with the DMT experience. It's so vast, and I do find that NDEs are much more prescriptive in that way, which is very interesting in and of itself.
Yeah.
So
and I suppose, yeah, what we then can't do from there is therefore say, well, therefore DMT, although it might be involved, isn't the be all end all, so therefore it's a spiritual experience. You can't say that, because there may be other drugs involved which share, you know, commonalities between the near-death experience in and of themselves. When mixed, you know, you have a cocktail that could produce this sort of thing. We don't know that. Do you know the paper? I'm sure you do, by Bruce Grace and others. I can't remember the name of it, but they investigate the terminology used between things like LSD, ketamine, DMT, and the terminology used to describe near-death experiences, and found a strong correlation between that. That's one reason why I like Dr. Bruce Grayson, because he does look at both possibilities. He's always looking for objective explanations first.
What was that study? It was Grayson looking at...
Let me find it for you. In the meantime, while I'm doing that, I wonder, what's your opinion on how all this would fit into the cases of near-death, we'll stick with near-death experiences, where the veridical perception that takes place alongside these other more mystical experiences allegedly take place while the brain is registered to be flat, so no cortical activity at all.
Sorry, what was that last bit? I think you glitched out a bit.
Did I? Okay, so what does all this imply then for those cases of veridical perception that take place allegedly while the brain is being monitored on the EEG and is shown to be flat, so no cortical activity?
Yeah, well, I listened to one with Worley, and he's looked into the Pam Reynolds case quite a bit. So it's good to, because obviously I've read him, and he had said some different stuff which he hadn't said in the papers, at least that I'd read. So yeah, I mean, let's just talk about Pam and his kind of views just first, just because I mean there are loads of experiences which are case studies which are equally as interesting actually, but hers is just like kind of a go-to. So yeah, I mean, he was very much trying to, and it's great because like we say, like if you have to look at these details which may well point to a materialist worldview, whether you like it or not, you know, you have to look at them. Of course, the people who are maybe too open-minded don't do that, so it's great that he did that, but I still wasn't completely convinced. You know, he was saying that Pam Reynolds, so I guess maybe your listeners know or don't, but you know, she underwent hypothermic cardiac arrest, which is a special procedure to surgically remove an aneurysm. But to do that, they had to put her under anesthetic, they had to cool her brain, they had to drain her brain of blood and stop her heart. So she was very much dead in a clinical sense for about 40 minutes or whatever it was. But then at the same time, she was also given that she had headphones on which had 100 decibel clicks, so as to evoke potentials in the brainstem, so as to basically check that she was still alive on a brainstem level. And then she also had her eyes taped shut. And then she also recounted these out-body type experiences which seemed to be veridical. She said that she saw the neurosurgeon saw and the casing that was associated with it, and heard certain things going on. And she also recounted this actual near-death experience of, you know, lights being bathed in the breath of God, and encountering deceased loved ones. Yes, but so what is important that he said is that the veridical out-of-body experience did not. So in terms of the what was in the actual consensus reality environment of the surgical room, what she saw of that wasn't actually during the time of the brain being of the device which drained her blood and stopped her heart wasn't active at the time. So actually you'd want that veridical information to line up with when her brain was completely devoid of blood and that her heart was completely stopped, but that wasn't really the case. The out-of-body experience seemed to be just before and just after. So that's interesting because lots of skeptics say, yes, people have these experiences when the brain is shutting down and then coming back online. But then Worley also said she could hear and see, but he said that he, in good field research, definitely like putting the headphones on.
Yeah, absolutely.
He said that the 100 decibel clicks, he could still hear everything that was going on. I absolutely have no idea how that's possible because they're 100 decibels. But again, like you said, we actually don't know. And this is the thing, when you get down into the details, there's so many factors, but in this case, that you don't know if the clicks were continuous, or if they were just occasional.
They were continuous.
That's
from Dr. Jan Holden, yeah.
Jan, because okay, that's interesting. But Worley said he wasn't sure, so they might have been, might not have been.
I mean,
even if they were, sorry to cut you off, but
that's fine. Go on.
Thing is that even because this is the thing that, you know, is important to have been stressed in that like interview with Worley and stuff, is that even if you could potentially hear, and even if the tape was thin such that you could, you know, if she didn't have sufficient anesthesia and she was kind of waking up and she was kind of, you'd get such an unbelievably blurred, such an unbelievably diminished sensory experience that it would be very, very hard to construct anything, or for your brain to internally construct a model of what's going on. But yeah, I just think it's highly unlikely.
Yeah, indeed. And, you know, not making excuses, but Dr. Joel Verley, with the timing of when the veridical perception took place, it is contended that what Dr. Verley said, that it didn't take place, that is contended by several other researchers I know who have seen the medical records. and have sent me via email. I can probably get you in touch with one of them, and he'll clear it up.
That'd be great.
But again, we're just taking words for it, unless we go and see the medical records ourselves. But that is contended, and Dr. Verley has been accused of skewing the facts of the medical records to fit his. I don't know if that's true. I'm not accusing him. I don't know if that's true. He seemed a perfectly reasonable guy to me. But that there are allegations of that. Of course, there are back and forward as well. As I say, with the continuous clicks, that's what Jan told me in our first interview. How she knows that she is a researcher, so I imagine she has dug into it. But that's what I heard. And the other thing is, Pam said that she heard the thing that she heard. If that was taking place while the clicks were going on, what's interesting to me is that she heard the veridical aspects, but didn't report hearing the clicks. So to me, if it is that she heard these things because of lack of anesthesia or whatever, wouldn't you have thought, since the sound is coming still through the ears, you'd still hear those clicks?
That's a very good point.
100 decibels.
So, like, if she was reconstructing things or just directly hearing through audition, but she didn't report the clicks. She
would have reported the clicks that have been moulded directly into a canal. And Dr. Verley's opposition to that is that, well, because she was a musician, her brain had been trained to kind of focus in on certain sounds and disregard others. Which, okay, fair enough, but to me, 100 decibels.
Exactly.
That's what I'd think. But I haven't done that experiment that he said he was able to hear the clicks, so I don't know.
Yeah, but I think this comes down to human beings and like the philosophy of science, because you can collate all of this evidence, but the fact is we're looking at the Leviathan, or maybe that's too pejorative, but of the prevailing scientific worldview, which is just so entrenched. And then you've got these experiences which potentially indicate otherwise, even with mounting evidence. And so it's much easier for these people, let's not say skeptics per se, but just people that have been trained as to this particular worldview. It's so much easier for them to stitch all this stuff together, like we're saying with Volley in this case. It seems like clutching at straws, like, oh, but she's a musician, her brain's been trained so as to not hear the clicks and just focus on what's salient, the person's voice, etc. To us, it might seem like clutching at straws potentially, but to someone who's just immersed in accepting the materialist worldview, it's like, of course, that's more likely than saying that there's this whole transcendent reality which we absolutely know, dick about.
I mean, absolutely.
Model.
Arguing from induction, everything has been physical in nature that we've discovered that we thought previously was, lightning being the wrath of God or whatever, has always been found to be physical. So of course, using induction, of course, this is going to be physical as well.
Yeah.
So that's kind of it's almost a promissory. We'll find out why, but it won't be anything other than material.
Exactly. This promissory neuroscience. Exactly. Which is what it's very much criticised for.